figure out our new technology communicating with one another, and turns out the technology of the base ceiling Stein probably is easier than the adapting to it. My name is Mark DeSaulnier. I'm the chair of the Senate Transportation and Housing Committee. I want to thank you all for coming, and for those of you who are participating, also thank you. One of our participants is sick today. Professor Deacon will not be joining us, so just want to let you all know that at the outset, and we hope that Professor Deacon, who has a internationally and a deserved reputation on transportation, feels better. As somebody who's suffering from a cold, I can empathize with her. So the purpose of today's hearing, this is the third in a series of hearings overall on just how we can deliver transportation projects better in the state of California and what we can do to make sure that the department, the agency and the department is amongst the best at what it's charged to do in the world and the country. Specifically, we've been looking into, in the first two hearings, into the Bay Bridge, and the overall title of these hearings are Lessons Learned from that experience. It is not meant to be an exercise in gotcha, although sometimes that is, I think, a perception that some people will have, but it's an exercise in truth-telling, finding out what went wrong, what went right, and what we can learn from the experience. And today is more how we can transform what we've learned so far to the larger agency and organization. And with us today, we have Secretary Kelly, a very well-respected, and his family is a group of constituents, so I have another reason to be nice to him today. How's your dad? I hope everything's well with him, and his voter registration is all up to date. Just kidding. But the challenges we have in transportation in California are real and right in front of us. For those of us who have spent a good deal of our careers in transportation in various levels, we know of the importance of transportation infrastructure to a growing economy that is like no other state in this country, certainly, and like no other economy of its size in the world, I would say, in terms of its entrepreneurial spirit, but also the demand that entrepreneurial spirit and culture in the private sector and the public sector puts on those of us who are in charge of providing infrastructure to make sure that works. So economists will tell us and tell me that the two most singularly important thing to a growing economy and a global economy is infrastructure and education and transportation. So for those of us who are used to dealing with projects and the engineering aspects of transportation, which is how we actually do these functions, we also are mindful of the real-life impacts to individuals in California and to the larger impacts of our doing our job well and being responsive to the clients, but also those impacts to the larger economy. I'm reminded, and I said this earlier, at a speech that I was fortunate enough to be asked to give every year to the California Transportation Foundation, that California still is the 9th largest economy in the world with a gross domestic product, if we were a country, of almost $2 trillion. That's a third of what the second largest economy in the world, the Chinese, have. So it's no small accomplishment for 38 million people. But the demands on that economy and the fact that we get more patents by far and large than any other state, 3 times the amount of the state of Texas, from our constituents, and over 50% of the venture capital in the United States comes to this state, is all an indication of the importance of us getting our job right to continue that economy. So that's the purpose of these series of hearings, ultimately to see if the Department of Transportation and our sister agencies, both at the local and regional level, are producing an infrastructure system that is world-class and can sustain this amazing state and the people in it and the economy that is truly world-class when it comes to innovation. And we should expect no less of our public institutions, and particularly in this instance to Caltrans, the Department of Transportation, an agency who I frequently start these hearings with the acknowledgement that most of the people at Caltrans, almost all of them, are dedicated, honest, hardworking public servants, and we're lucky to have them. But that's not to say that we can't do better, and for those people who don't live up to the high standards we expect, they should be held accountable. So with that, we will turn over to our panel and ask Secretary Kelly and Mr. Rogers and Mr. Kaufman to come forward, and we will go in the order that you appear on the agenda. We'll start with Mr. Kelly, and whenever Mr. Rogers and Mr. Kaufman, maybe you can just sit at the second table. We'll go through your opening comments, and then we'll hold questions until the end. I want to take a chance or take an opportunity for Senator Roth, who's joined us, who's a wonderful committee member, and there'll be other committee members who will join us during the hearing, as there are other informational hearings going on in the building, one of which I'm supposed to participate in at some point. So, Senator Roth, have any opening comments? Yes. Okay. Secretary Kelly. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss with you and the committee the recently released external review of Caltrans that my agency requested in May of 2013. The review was conducted by the State Smart Transportation Initiative, an entity affiliated with the University of Wisconsin that works with many state departments of transportation around the country to improve performance and to suggest policy solutions to modern transportation challenges. I first became acquainted with SSTI after reading a best practices report it published referencing practices from around the country at different DOTs. That report was called the Innovative DOT. SSTI was ultimately chosen to conduct this review in large part because it offered a very unique opportunity for us, and that was to tap the experience of individuals who have run major departments of transportation around the country. This particular review included the input from former department heads from Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and North Carolina, who, as the report notes, led cultural change of the transportation departments in those states. The SSTI members here today include Professor Joel Rogers to my left and Eric Sundquist behind me, who will tell you more about SSTI and who will also summarize the findings of their review. I just want to spend a moment, if I could, Mr. Chairman, thanking the members of SSTI for the work they put into the project. It's worth noting that over the course of 7 months, the team interviewed some 110 people within and outside of the department to develop its assessment of the department and to provide to us a set of recommendations going forward. They poured over thousands of pages of documents, including prior reviews of the department, audits, guidelines, policy papers, etc. Suffice it to say, a lot of work went into this report, and I thank the SSTI team for its effort. Before I turn to Professors Rogers and Sundquist to summarize their work, I just want to share with you a couple of my own observations about the report. As I noted, I called for this review last year because, like you, Mr. Chairman, and consistent with many of our conversations, we are both interested in improving Caltrans and making it a responsive department to the taxpayers in California. This report provides a set of recommendations toward that objective. The recommendations rely on concepts like modernization, culture change, and performance-based management to achieve improvement. The Transportation Agency concurs with the notion of modernization at Caltrans and is committed to seeing these concepts implemented. The report recommends focusing existing resources first on asset management, concepts like preserving the current highway system, keeping it in a state of good repair, and operating the existing system better. I generally agree with this approach. It is not okay to have highways ranked 48th nationally in pavement condition and have nearly 40% of our operational equipment, ramp metering lights, cameras, changeable message signs, in a non-working condition. And so a better assessment of our asset management plan and moving forward in that direction is a policy direction that I concur with. As I stated, fix it first or improved asset management makes sense, particularly in a time of scarce resources, and I would like the department's performance going forward to be measured against how it performs first and foremost in this area. The report concludes, among other things, that the department can and should be an important player in the state's efforts to achieve sustainability goals. While the department has a long history of delivering on safety and highway mobility objectives, it is true that current law and policy demands more from the department on the issue of sustainability. Regions throughout California have adopted transportation plans designed to meet mobility, safety, and sustainability goals. The state must do the same. This area provides real opportunity for the department to be an innovator. Its mission must reflect how it will help the state deliver on these important objectives contained in legislation passed by this legislature and enacted into law by both Democratic and Republican administrations. Finally, a brief note about the men and women who work at the department. The report itself notes the openness with which the department faced this review. It describes how department personnel discussed problems openly with the review team and made available documents to the SSTI team in a timely manner. This response, openness and communicative, is the right response to challenges the department faces. The report also describes a collective hunger among department staff to modernize the department's mission and clarify the vision and goals to meet that mission. Achieving necessary change requires this kind of commitment, so I want to thank the leadership and staff of the department for buying into this process of review, and I call on that same spirit as we transition into the implementation phase. With those observations, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to turn it over to the SSTI team to summarize the review, and of course I look forward to answering any of your questions today.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mr. Rogers.
Hi. Good afternoon. My name is Joel Rogers, and I'm joined here by Eric Sundquist, directly to my back. I'm the Sewell Bascom Professor of Law, Political Science, Public Affairs, and Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the director of SSTI, the nonprofit group that BTH contracted for to do the assessment of Caltrans. Eric is the managing director of SSTI. We are among the co-authors of the report that you have in front of you. And bear, I guess, final responsibility for it. I'll provide our opening testimony, but both Eric and I are available to take for any sort of follow-up questions you might have. Okay? I propose to be fairly brief, maybe 15 minutes max, limiting myself to a brief introduction of SSTI, top-line summary of the report's assessment and recommendations, and then severely abbreviated answers to some of the questions you posed to us, namely about what's the projected speed of enactment of the reforms and what's the appropriate legislative involvement in making sure those happen. On SSTI, let me just assure you, we don't have two professors here, only one. There's only one academic involved in the actual team. There are a bunch of PhDs, but most of the people are in fact very practical folks who've run large departments in the past or technical consultants of various sorts on transportation. SSTI's purpose, as the Secretary mentioned, is to improve the productivity and accountability of state transportation efforts, and then to maximize their safety, resource conservation, and wealth generation in their transportation investments and practices. We do a lot of public education and blogs and reports up the kazoo on how those varied goals can be achieved, and we work with about 20 state DOT CEOs whose leadership participates in the project. We provide them with individualized technical assistance on solving problems in their state. We tend to select for problems that we think occur in several states and from which we can then help diffuse good practice. We regularly summarize that best practice, including in the book that Brian just alluded to, The Innovative DOT, and we also regularly gather these transportation CEOs for meetings to discuss common problems and emerging solutions. While we do some original research, I want to stress our primary aim in all this is to move the needle on actual practice. Okay, so this is not an academic pointy-head think tank. It's basically something based at a university that spends most of its time dealing with people in the field. And that's reflected in the composition of the team we put together for the Caltrans assessment, where indeed there were several PhDs, but only one academic, and the bulk of the team were transportation consultants with long experience in the field. Many indeed had previously run transportation departments. Okay, so much for SSTI. Now to the report. The assessment, as I think you know, was commissioned by BTH last May because its leadership and Governor Brown thought that that agency's impending demise and the formation of CalSTA, of which Caltrans would continue to be a very big part, provided a unique opportunity to take a big look at Caltrans. Caltrans practice and for making recommendations for improvement. We were not asked to assess Caltrans performance on topical projects like the Bay Bridge. That's why we didn't look at the Bay Bridge, but we were asked to look at its sort of organizational DNA, if you were. Was the department doing the right things well and with accountability? Did it manage its assets and employees well? Did it communicate effectively with the public, et cetera? A more detailed listing of the particular questions with those varied categories of performance is provided in the report. But our brief and negative answer to all of them, after reading through those thousands of pages of documents that Secretary alluded to, and all sorts of reports, and doing the interviews with 100-plus Caltrans employees, former employees, other stakeholders, et cetera, was no. That's not a new conclusion. It's not particularly original either. It's the same sort of conclusion that SRI came to in its review of the department in 1994, and it itself had reviewed 20 years of previous assessments, which came to roughly the same conclusion. So, bringing it to the present, essentially we found that the operative mission and goals of Caltrans are out of step, and in some measure working at cross purposes with or to the transportation needs and broad public policy framework of AB 32, SB 375, and other relevant California law. We also found that the current skills and technical resources of the department were neither adequate to nor aligned with the smart mobility goals that the department itself has formally embraced and that are congruent with those needs in that framework. But still not generally pursued by Caltrans itself. And we found the department deficient in its communication and management. Broadly, we call for the department to modernize and to go through a painful process of culture change with more focus eventually on results rather than rule-bound process, and with both greater autonomy offered to and greater accountability demanded from managers and line employees in meeting those goals. The report itself is divided into three sections. The first gives the history and sub-explanation of how Caltrans got so out of step with modern management techniques and California policy. And here, for this audience in particular, I'd note that that is not entirely Caltrans' problem. You, the legislature, have a heavy hand in making it as dysfunctional as you now find it. In the second part of the report, we go through the many deficiencies in practice and effective policy we find in the department at present. And then in the third part, we offer recommendations for action. I'll focus here on that third part, on the recommendations. There, following the three buckets from which we started, they're grouped by mission and goals, resource adequacy and alignment, and management. And I'll just, I won't go through all the recommendations. There are 46 of them, specific recommendations, but they're grouped into 10 top-line categories. Let me just read those for you, and we can always go into more detail in the discussion. First, Caltrans needs to establish a mission, vision, and associated goals that reflect current state law and policy. Second, it's got to better match investments to policy goals expressed in that statement of mission, vision, and goals. Third, it's got to take advantage of the state's new institutional structure to help drive change, which essentially involves a lot of stuff around working out better relationships with other state agencies that can help or hinder the achievement of vision, and also with the many locals that are very involved in actually delivering most of the transportation infrastructure at this point. On alignment of resources and skills, we want them to align resources to desired goals. That requires strengthening the planning unit, improving its ability to operate its highway system, modernizing its stewardship efforts through a better asset management system, providing more resources, expertise, or simply a real voice to planning and prioritization in the offices, dealing with rail and freight, developing an enhanced internal capability to identify and pursue innovative finance partnerships. Fifth, it should reform critical guidance documents and standard operating procedures. Caltrans, we found, was in many cases even behind AASHTO, the famously highway-dominated American Association of State Highway Transportation Officers, in terms of many of its guidances. That is the real DNA. That's what the engineers are looking to, and a lot of those simply need to be changed, updated, et cetera. Six, it does need to strengthen the strategic partnership in the area of sustainable transportation, find ways to transfer local roads to local governments, the so-called relinquishment project, and Caltrans and CalSTA should negotiate coverage for long-term maintenance, resurfacing, and reconstruction costs when locally controlled STIP and LTST funds are used to add capacity to state highways. Seventh, you've got to increase the focus on freight. As Senator Desaulniers mentioned, California is a very, very big economy, a very important economy to the country. It's also, basically the opening to Asia, and you have a lot of freight moving through here. You could do a much better job in moving it. We have specific suggestions on that, on the major transport corridors and whether highway, rail, or air should be used, but I'll spare you the details. 8, you got to communicate much more effectively. The website is sort of a mess. Caltrans is beginning to move on that, but it has to communicate around the performance metrics that are used to monitor progress over organizational goals. And actually, Malcolm Dougherty has begun to do that with their moving toward a gray book. I would suggest that maybe that, rather than these endless reports you requested them, is a better way to monitor their progress. All right, finally, manage for performance. There are a variety of things. This goes back to the SRI recommendations and previous management recommendations. Caltrans doesn't basically have a performance metric system with outcome-based management in place of a sort that managers can actually use in the day-to-day managing of employees. It does have that for project delivery, but not for almost anything else. 10th and last, you should foster innovation and continuing evolution. It should insist on robust implementation of state policies and rely on staff for implementation details. It should benchmark practice against best practices elsewhere. It should integrate its research better into its design and other functions, a variety of other things to try to foment a culture of innovation in the department. Now, under those 10 broad recommendations, again, we make these 46 specific recommendations. The list is pretty daunting in its length and the complexity of what's required. So a natural question is, how do you begin and how do you keep it going? And we suggest in the report 4 things where you can start quickly. Some of them are already sort of starting already, but let's move them quickly, get them done quickly. And we think that doing those things decisively, pushing them through in a timely way, and we suggest a 6-month timeline on this, on all of them, will signal to stakeholders in Caltrans, I'm thinking of the developers, the local, the MPOs and the other, local groups, the self-help county folks and everything else that they traditionally have disputes with, will signal to all those people Caltrans' new intentions. And I think it will also excite those employees that the Secretary mentioned. We found a bunch of them, a bunch of unmet demand for exactly the sorts of changes that we're talking about. And basically, as a management problem, what you have to do is empower and excite the people who are already on your side. Right now, they're more timid than they need be. What are those 4 things that we think you can move on very quickly? Well, one is Caltrans and CalSTA could develop that mission, vision, and goal statements that are fully consistent with state planning and policy goals. They should explain conceptually what Caltrans' role is in sustainability, livability, and equitable economic development. The department's own 2040 long-range plan, which has been constructed in parallel to but separate from its 5-year strategic plan, is one source of that. The Smart Mobility Report that it endorsed and issued a few years ago is another source. We think you've got language around, but you've got to get everyone together and say, okay, this is the new direction, and that's different than just promoting mobility and safety. Second, following the release of that mission, that new mission, vision, and goal, and you got to get that down to the goal level. What are our goals in terms of VMT? What are our goals in terms of land use? What are our goals in terms of, whatever? Make it actually operational. Second, after the release of that, we recommend that Caltrans and CalSTA use those statements, as well as the recommendations in the report, to organize a series of teams, sometimes around functional problems, sometimes around substantive policy problems, sometimes around actual process within the department, where there are problem areas that are highlighted in the report. Simply get all the players together, put them in a room and say, okay, so have we described the problem correctly? If not, let's amend it. Okay, how could we possibly solve this problem? How would we measure our solving that? Just do a standard performance metric exercise, but actually get something in sufficiently granular detail at the end that managers can actually work with it. Third, and CalSTA has certainly already started with this with the involvement of Kate White, with the OPR folks who are charged with doing it, but we're big enthusiasts of the move by the legislature in SB 743. We think that could be a real game changer in California, would put you on the lead in terms of a bunch of transportation practice. If you actually make the schedule of developer fees in some way inverse to vehicle miles traveled as a result of the development, that would be a big, big thing, a great anti-sprawl measure. And we're delighted to see the level of support it's got in California, and I would simply urge you as much as possible to encourage Caltrans and CalSTA's continued involvement with that as it works toward what I think is a July deadline for actually getting some sort of executive guidance out. And then finally, fourth and finally, and this again we think can be done relatively quickly. It doesn't take 10 years. You should modernize the state transportation design guidance. The books that folks are using are simply out of date. Lots of other states have better stuff. You can use them as examples. And we think that that can be done. That's what you really need for the culture change, because essentially Caltrans and most state departments of transportation are giant engineering firms. And the engineers are smart, but they're going to follow the book. And you change the book, and that's the way to get them to change their behavior. Finally, and again, very abbreviated, Senators Roth and DeSaulnier, let me try to answer some of your questions. Putting aside for the moment your question about the CTC, let me reframe your questions as asking us basically how rapidly you're going and why should we be confident you'll get there, and then how can we be involved and how can we help? Fair questions. And my answers to both sorts of questions can be abbreviated in part because I'm not the right guy to answer them. SSTI is not the right person. You should be asking those only of the Secretary and others. But I can offer a few observations on both based on SSTI's experience with other DOTs. On the first question, can you do it and do it quickly? I'm cautiously optimistic that you can for two reasons. One is, and fully recognizing the uniqueness of California. If you've met one state, you've met one state. And that's particularly true in California. If you've met one state DOT, you've met only one state DOT. Given all that uniqueness, it is the case that, and not native to your state, I never want to be on the losing side of an argument disputing your uniqueness, okay? But the general problem we describe in the report, inattention to climate and land use goals, being outdated in management practices, et cetera, those are hardly unique to California. Other state DOTs have faced such problems and overcome them, and that should be a source of solace and hope for you. That's happened in Massachusetts, in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, in Oregon, in Washington, a variety of different states, in Utah, in Colorado. So there are lots of states that you can look to who are willing to work with you to help improve this. All that Caltrans has to do is be humble enough to admit that it is maybe something to learn from others. But I'm confident there's a very great deal of good practice that can be implemented relatively quickly. You're not going to see full tilt boogie culture change overnight. I don't want to underestimate the task. I mean, moving a big ship of 19,000 people in a substantially different direction is not something you do in a week, but you need not wait at all long to see signs of it and measure its progress. Okay, so that's one reason for optimism. The second reason for optimism we've alluded to already. In our interviews with employees, we detected tremendous unmet demand for exactly the sorts of changes we recommend. Of course, the employees are somewhat skeptical of the possibilities of such change. Wouldn't you be too if you've been sitting in Caltrans for 10 or 15 years? But they surely want it. And so with appropriate leadership, we think you could turn the ship around. And what we'd like to comment on is you need that leadership, of course, but we can only say we're quite impressed with the leadership you just put in place in CalSTA and in Caltrans itself. We think Secretary Kelly has put together a high-quality, small executive team around him, and we very much welcome and very much respect Malcolm Dougherty's totally non-defensive, yeah, great, this is an opportunity, let's get on it, read on the report. So from top to bottom, we think you've got some agents of change there and something to work with, okay? What you can do as a legislature, and again, just give you an SSTI perspective on this, I just suggest a couple of things and only a couple of things only. One, take the Secretary's interest in having you or your staff involved in a lot of the discussions, for example, around the performance metrics or other things that they're doing. Take that seriously. Send some staff over or come over yourselves. That's the only way to find out the nature of the problem and CalSTA's and Caltrans' commitment to solving them, and that may give you an idea of other things, more fine-grained that you can do to help. Second, and all important, give CalSTA and CalSTANS a little breathing room. I'm not suggesting that you treat everything that, trust but verify is the old Russian saying that Ronald Reagan usefully pilfered and made famous. I'm not asking you to take whatever Brian or Malcolm or someone else across the street says as gospel, but give them a little time. Nobody's asking for more than that to begin to get their shop in order. These guys inherited these problems. They didn't create them. Moving a ship is a big thing. Third, along the way, of course, it would be useful for you to roll back on the massive and, in our view, just our view, I'm just saying, as my kids say, generally not particularly useful. 23-plus reports you ask Caltrans to deliver every year. They have a lot of staff just working on those reports. It's not clear to us really how much use you're getting out of them. Maybe talk to them and CALSA about better ways to perform your extremely important oversight function. We're not questioning your need to do that. We just think this endless reporting may not be the most optimal. And fourth and last, give CALSA and Caltrans the HR flexibility and the budget resources needed to make the changes as sweeping as we suggest, and give them some political cover in doing that, and work with them more as a partner, not adversary, in improving California's transportation system. What does that mean? Well, it means a million things and nothing at the same time, but certainly don't exclude them anymore from discussions that have obvious bearing on transportation investments, as you did with 375 and 743. Transportation is very heavily determinative, as the Senator made clear in his opening remarks, of all sorts of stuff that you need to worry about for the public good: land use, climate, equity, economic development. If you've got an agency and a department also committed to California's goals on those things, invite them into all the discussions that concern those. Okay? And last and probably least, the suggestion that CTC was simply, and I was talking to Andre very briefly before, and he said, yeah, it's a great idea, was simply that you should avoid the Hobson's choice, as CTC's, I guess, currently compelled to navigate all the time. Hobson's choice between slowing down good projects or accepting bad ones. The only way to do that is to separate action on them, and be able to let CTC be able to do things on a project-by-project basis. Those are the end of my remarks. Thank you.